I used to work at the local public library when I was in my early 18s. I'd work the night shifts as my second job at least 4 times a week. After my first job, I'd get there at 5 o'clock and would work till closing time at 10 o'clock. I would also be the one to lock up the place after closing, but I wouldn't just leave right after the library closed. I'd have to shut off all the computers, do some cleaning and organizing, stock the shelves with all the returned books and DVDs from the day, take out the garbage, and only then could I leave. It was a Friday night approaching closing time. Most of the other library staff was gone already. It was just myself and one of the female librarians left. I had made a couple of last call announcements to the remaining library patrons, alerting them that the library would be closing soon. I was already cleaning up the place, trying to finish up early so I could leave and just start my weekend. The only other employee still there said goodbye to me as soon as the clock struck 10 o'clock. I announced on the intercom that the library was closed. The 2 guests that were left got up from their tables and started packing up their things before leaving through the door. After that, when I saw no one else in the building, I locked the front door. I proceeded to start fixing all the chairs to be neatly tucked under their tables. Then I started emptying all the garbage cans, and when it was time to bring them outside to the dumpster on the side, I unlocked the front door again and brought them out. It was quiet outside. The library was kind of tucked away from any main roads. When I came back inside, I locked the door again. Now all I had to do was restock all the returned books and DVDs from the day. I grabbed the 2 boxes and started with the DVDs, which was easier since the DVD section was smaller. It took about 5 to 10 minutes. During this time, I thought for sure I heard something come from one of the book aisles. I started walking through the aisles till I found an open book laying on the floor, which had clearly just fallen off the shelf. I put it back in its place, and for a second, I stood there and just wondered how that could have happened. I went back to work, and after finishing the DVDs, I took the box of books and started putting them one by one back on the shelves, going in alphabetical order. I started with the A's. The books in the box were sorted in alphabetical order to make it easy. As I worked my way down the shelves, trying to bang this out and go home, I heard another noise nearby. 2 times in less than 20 minutes. That was no coincidence. I set the box down and started walking through the aisles of books again. I found another 2 books on the ground in another aisle. Someone was in here. I walked out to the open area with all the tables and such and yelled out, "Excuse me, the library is closed." There was silence until I heard something from across the library from the children's section. I approached the noises, and it started to sound like some rabid animal making growling sounds. I also heard books being thrown onto the floor. It was coming from one aisle. As I built up the courage to peek down the aisle, I saw some woman wearing a nightgown throwing random books off the shelf, making these disgusting animal-like sounds. I didn't say anything. I turned and ran to the office where we had the phone. I didn't have a cell phone at this time. I locked the office door and closed the blinds to the window, then I called 911. I reported that there was some sickly woman in the library and I think they should send an ambulance. They asked if I had approached the woman, and I said no, she looked like she could be dangerous. When the operator asked me if the woman was still in the same spot, I opened the blinds and I screamed because that woman was right on the other side of the glass looking in. Her pupils were so big that she looked demonic. I said to the operator, "She's right outside the office." The woman started to bang on the glass, screaming gibberish. She tried opening the door, and when it didn't open, she turned around and sat on a chair facing the office. The operator asked me to keep the blind open and watch her. The woman was wobbly as she sat down, so I noted she was definitely high out of her mind. 2 police cars and an ambulance showed up to the library. The woman was put in handcuffs because she tried fighting the police officers, but nothing she was saying made any sense. She was put in the back of an ambulance and was taken away. I never found out what the hell she was on. I don't know how she got inside, maybe while I was taking the garbage out, or maybe she was inside before I even locked the place up. Either way, it definitely made being in the library alone after closing pretty unsettling from there on out. This is something that happened a long time ago when I went to my local library. It was probably the year 2000. I remember that I was going there to get some educational books. The internet was around back then, but you couldn't quite just Google whatever you wanted to know like that. The more common method for me was to go to the library and check out books on the topic. So anyways, I drove down to the library, which was maybe 10 minutes from my house. I went inside, and it was a little bit later. I think they closed soon. I just know that I was about the only person inside. The library was somewhat large, and I made my way to the aisle of bookshelves where I was looking for. Then I began trying to find the best books to check out. I spent a few minutes looking at books and comparing. During this time, after a while, I heard someone approaching. The library had been especially quiet. Everybody knows libraries are usually very quiet, but with hardly anybody there, it was to another level. The footsteps sounded like they were about to enter the aisle that I was in. So naturally, I looked up. But when I did, I didn't see anybody at all. It was like they had stopped right before they reached the corner of my aisle. I thought that maybe it would be a librarian telling me that the library was closing soon or something, but nobody seemed to be there at all. I then went back to what I was doing. I was very focused on comparing the books because I wanted to get the best ones. Several more minutes went by. Then I remember casually looking up and glancing over to the end of the aisle. When I did, I suddenly noticed that there was a woman standing there. She was almost leaning around the corner and looking at me. This woman appeared to be a little bit younger, had blonde hair, but was wearing these strange-looking sunglasses, and she was looking right at me. I looked away because it was just really strange and focused my attention back down on the book that I was holding. But when I did, I realized just how strange this was. I also realized that this was likely the same person who I had heard approaching, but that was like 5 minutes ago. Had she been standing there this whole time? I looked back up again from the book and glanced in her direction. She was still staring at me and hadn't moved. I kept looking at her, surprised and confused. I didn't know what to say or do. Finally, as I was looking at her, she suddenly moved back very quickly and went out of my sight. I then walked over to the end of the bookshelf where she had been and looked out. I was wondering where she had gone, but I couldn't see her. She likely had gone to another aisle. That little situation was very strange. I then hurried up and finished selecting books. I picked out 3 different books and then headed to check them out. When I did not notice seeing the woman at all. I then checked out my books, left the library, and went home. Now, I had these books for about 3 weeks and then had to return them to the library. I remember that night I knew that I was going to be in the area, so I brought the books with me. The library had a drop box outside, sort of near the side of the building. You could just drop the books out there at any time of day. The library did not have to be open. So on the way home that night, probably around 10 p.m., I stopped by the library. I parked in the empty parking lot and walked up to the drop box with the books. Now, to the right of the library building, kind of near the drop box, there was a little park area. It was just a few picnic tables and a little open space of grass. Beyond that was a bit of a wooded area. When I reached the drop box and put the books inside, I noticed something. There was a person on the edge of the woods that seemed really weird. When I looked closer, I saw that this was a woman with strange sunglasses, the very same woman who had been staring at me in the library before. I was so creeped out that I instantly turned around and ran back to my car. I drove home and didn't go back to that library again for months. I did return, though, and never saw that woman again. I still don't know who she was or what she was doing. I've always loved libraries, their quiet atmosphere, the smell of old books, and the chance to dive into a world of fantasy always drew me in. So, when I got a job as a librarian at an old library on the outskirts of our town in the USA, I was over the moon. But my joy quickly turned to fear when I realized this library harbored eerie secrets. My name is Carrick, and this story happened to me last fall. I was a new employee at the library, which was built at the beginning of the 20th century. It was huge, with high ceilings and walls covered with shelves of books. Most of them were old, with yellowed pages and worn covers, but that didn't scare me. On the contrary, I was captivated by the atmosphere. The first few weeks were ordinary. I helped visitors find the books they needed, organized new arrivals, and occasionally conducted tours for school children. But one evening, when I stayed at work later than usual, something strange happened. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was about to lock up the library when I heard a strange noise. It sounded like a quiet whisper coming from the far end of the library. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I got closer, I realized they were voices. They were talking to each other, but I couldn't understand a word. I followed the sound and found it was coming from the section of old books that no one had touched for years. This part of the library was darker and colder than the rest. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and began to examine the shelves. The books were covered in dust, and at first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But when I touched one of the books, the whispering suddenly stopped. A chill ran down my spine. It felt as if someone or something was watching me. I decided it was just my imagination and went back to work. But the next day, it got even stranger. When I arrived at work, I saw that the books on the shelves had been rearranged. None of my colleagues could have done it, as I was the last one to leave the library yesterday. Days passed, and the situation only worsened. Every evening I heard the same whispering, and every morning I found books out of place. I started losing sleep and felt constantly exhausted. My colleagues began to notice my unhealthy appearance, but I couldn't tell them the truth, fearing they would think I was crazy. One evening, when I again stayed late at work, I decided to solve this mystery. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I returned to that section of the library. I started recording everything, hoping to catch something on video. The whispering was louder than before, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up in fear. Suddenly, I saw a shadow darted between the shelves. I began to chase it, but it disappeared. I checked the camera recording, but it only showed an empty space. Then I noticed one book sticking out from the shelf more than the others. I pulled it out, and a hidden passage opened before my eyes. It led to an old room that seemed to have been abandoned for many years. The room was cold, and the air was thick with dust. On the table lay old records and diaries. I began to read them and discovered the horrifying truth. This library was built on the site of an old cemetery. During construction, Workers found ancient graves, but instead of reporting it to the authorities, they just walled them up. The souls of those buried here were angry and could not find peace. They tried to communicate with the living through the books, leaving messages and moving them. I realized they wanted only one thing: peace. I decided to help them and the next day contacted the city authorities. After lengthy negotiations, they agreed to exhume and move the remains to another location. Once this was done, the whispering stopped. The library became quiet, and I felt the fear gradually dissipate. But I will always remember that eerie whispering and those shadows that haunted me at night. Every time I pass by that old section, I feel a shiver down my spine, reminding me of the echoes of the past that have now found their peace. My name is Lucas. My job at the library isn't the most exciting in the world, but it provides a steady income, and I've always loved books. However, recent events have made me rethink my feelings about this place. It all started a few weeks ago when I received a call from our library director, Mr. Tom. He asked me to stay late to help with the inventory of new arrivals. The library was old, with massive wooden shelves and heavy velvet curtains on the windows. It was always a bit gloomy, even during the day. When I arrived in the evening, Mr. Tom was already there. He seemed a bit nervous, but I didn't pay much attention to it. We were sorting books onto the shelves, checking lists, and talking about various small things. It seemed like it would be an ordinary night. Around midnight, Mr. Tom decided to leave, leaving me alone. I continued working when I suddenly heard a faint rustling sound somewhere between the shelves. At first, I thought it was a mouse, but the sound repeated, becoming louder and clearer. I felt a slight chill down my spine but decided to ignore it. As I continued working, I noticed the lights in the library began to flicker. The bulbs would dim and then brighten again, creating a strange and eerie atmosphere. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check if everything was all right with the electricity. Walking through the rows of shelves, I didn't find anything suspicious, but the rustling didn't stop. It seemed to follow me. Returning to my desk, I noticed that one of the books I had just placed on the shelf was again on the floor. It was an old dusty book that seemed like no one had opened it in years. I picked it up and opened the first page. It had the author's name, but the ink had somehow blurred, making the letters indecipherable. Suddenly, I heard a voice, quiet and whispering. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to hide my anxiety. No one answered, but the rustling grew louder and came closer to me. I felt my heart beat faster and decided it was best to check the entire library. Maybe it was just a trick of light and shadows, or maybe someone decided to prank me. Walking between the shelves, I felt the walls closing in around me. The space was becoming narrower and darker. I tried to find the source of the sound, but it seemed omnipresent. A shadow I saw out of the corner of my eye made me freeze in place. I turned around but saw nothing. At that moment, when I returned to my desk, the lights went out again. Only the beam of my flashlight pierced the thick darkness. I felt a cold breath on my neck. Something or someone was here with me. I quickly dialed Mr. Tom's number, but the call wouldn't go through. Panic began to take hold of me. Deciding that the best thing would be to leave the library and come back in the morning, I moved toward the exit, but the doors were locked. I distinctly remembered not locking them. While searching for the key, I heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer and more distinct. "You shouldn't have opened that book," the voice said. I turned and saw a shadow on the wall moving towards me. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The light from the flashlight suddenly went out, leaving me in complete darkness. "Do you know why this library is empty at night?" whispered the voice ever closer. "This place is cursed." I felt something cold and sticky touch my hand. I tried to fight it off, but my movements were paralyzed. The feeling of helplessness and fear overwhelmed me completely. When I finally found the key, I managed to open the door and ran outside. The cold night wind bit my face, but I was glad to be out. I looked back and saw the library standing quietly and darkly, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I returned but didn't dare tell Mr. Tom about everything that had happened. He just looked at me suspiciously and said he no longer needed my help on night shifts. Since then, I no longer stay at the library at night, but sometimes when I walk past its doors, I feel something where someone watching me from the darkness between the shelves. And I know I will never forget that night when the shadows came to life. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.